Welcome to the Learn at Work webinar series presented by Work, a journal of prevention, assessment, and rehabilitation. The publisher is iOS Press. The 2018 Learn at Work webinars are presented in collaboration with the Human Factors and Ergonomic Society. I'm your moderator. I'm Dr. Karen Jacobs. I am the founding editor of the journal Work, and I'm delighted to moderate today's Learn at Work webinar. I'm going to turn it over to our speakers now. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we are here today to discuss a pilot study to precisely quantify forces applied by sonographers while scanning, a step towards reducing ergonomic injury. And I am Manish Thiani. I'm a radiology resident currently at Leahy Hospital and Medical Center. I did my medical training back in India, and prior to being a radiology resident, I was at the Center for Ultrasound Research and Translation at Massachusetts General Hospital, and some of this work is from my time there. And I will pass it on to Dr. Roll, who's the other panelist for this session.
Yes, I'm Sean Roll. I'm an occupational therapist and registered musculoskeletal sonographer and associate professor at the Chan Division of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy at the University of Southern California. And my background and work in research is primarily focused on assessment, prevention, and rehabilitation for musculoskeletal disorders. And I have mostly a passion for injury prevention and looking at ergonomics and trying to help improve kind of our understanding of how we can prevent those disorders. So this topic here specifically with sonographers, being both a sonographer and being interested in ergonomics is something that I'm very passionate about. And so I'm happy to be here to kind of talk with Manish and kind of share kind of the experiences here and a little bit broader about things that are going on in the profession. So this article it was published in Work, I believe, last year, 2017, and so you can go and kind of look it up and read it, and we're going to kind of talk through it. And the co-authors that are on the article are listed here, and from various different backgrounds, engineering and radiology as well. So it's kind of a nice team. I do have to let you know that I am an associate editor on the Journal of Diagnostic Medical Sonography, and there is some information that I'll provide at the end related to the society that's released some information regarding this, so I just make that disclosure. I wanted to start just to kind of go over real quickly kind of a background for kind of the importance of this work, and just to kind of indicate that, you know, musculoskeletal disorders are a pretty significant issue in the sonography profession. So if you want to advance a couple slides here, Manish.
Yeah, I'm sorry, it just sort of hung up on me.
Okay, well, I'll keep talking here and we'll catch up on the slides. Apologize for that. But basically, what we want to share is, as a background, is to know that musculoskeletal disorders for sonographers, we've done some research and we've looked at this, that up to 90% of sonographers actually are having pain while they're scanning and experiencing pain and problems. And of those sonographers, even up to 20% of them end up having career-ending injury. So they end up moving into other different occupations and other different things. Primarily what we find is that sonographers are going into education. And so once they are unable to actually work in the field anymore, they become educators and do things like that. So it's actually become a fairly significant issue. And this goes all the way back to the 80s, where sonographers started to report these problems, and prevalence has just been kind of inching up since then. And we haven't really been able to bring it down from that 90% threshold. And so we did kind of a full survey quite a few years ago and looked at a fairly representative sample here, about 2,600 sonographers, And we can see that the primary areas where sonographers have problems are basically from the neck through the shoulder and down to the wrist and hand. So it's pretty much the upper extremity and the arms that we see, you know, at least half to more kind of having problems in those regions. We further asked the sonographers to tell us a little bit more about what they consider to be the problematic parts of their job, and beyond kind of where the pain is, what's actually leading to that pain. So if we go one more slide up here, we have looking at positions and postures, in particular, and finding out whether or not doing different things sonographers feel like those are more aggravating or less aggravating. And you can see really the sitting and standing isn't really much of a problem in the perspective of the sonographers, but it's really when you get into holding the arm out to the side and abducting the shoulder, as well as doing some twisting. So some of these are fixable by just helping to train sonographers in the positioning that they're using. But the reality is that sonographers get into hospital rooms and get into rooms that are not well designed, and there's just not space. There's not room enough for them to actually move around and get the equipment where they need to, and they end up twisting to reach the machine and those sorts of things. When we switched and asked them about the specific demands of doing the imaging and what they felt was causing problems, we can see that the main thing that kind of popped up here was applying pressure through the transducer. And that 60% of people indicated that having to apply pressure through that transducer is really what was causing them a lot of problems. And this is in particular for sonographers. Most imaging, typical imaging that you're doing doesn't require a lot of pressure or force. You can just hold the transducer lightly and kind of move it around. However, what we're seeing is that, especially with the population becoming more heavy sets with obesity, different things that way, in order to do abdominal scanning or to get good images, sonographers are having to push the transducer in a lot in order to get good resonation of the sound waves through some of the subcutaneous fat tissues and things like that. In addition, vascular sonographers do different things where they actually do have to apply pressure through the transducer in order to coapt the vessels and close the vessels off and let them come open. So there's a lot of pressure that gets applied, and then when you're pushing not only down through the transducer, you have a tendency to then start to grip and squeeze harder because you get gel on your hands and different things. So really this pressure and this force is very problematic. And when we look at the amount of time and the number of scans that individuals do each day and the amount of time that they do, they're really spending a lot of their day doing this activity. So on the next slide here, you'll see that the time per scan, especially for vascular technologists, 20 to 30 minutes or more is really where a lot of the sonographers are spending their time doing these scans. So you can imagine 20 or 30 minutes of applying pressure, applying force, and doing that scan 10 to 15 times a day. Really, they're not getting a lot of break. They're not getting a lot of rest time throughout their day. So really, you know, as we looked at this, there's been lots and lots of surveys, there's been lots of data that's been done to show that there's this problem, and we really don't necessarily understand how to intervene on this problem, and there's really not been a lot of objective kind of measurement of what this force actually is. Some of the measurement of the force has come in electromyographic studies where we put where we measure just the muscle force itself, but that really isn't getting to what's happening to the hand and the different things that way. So that kind of leads up to the purpose of the study here. And so I'll turn it over to Manish to talk a little bit more about exactly kind of where this transducer housing came from and where things are headed. So it's over to you then, Manish, if we can get the presentation to pop up again.
Yeah, it just crashed on me just at the right time. Sorry about that. While that's coming up, so just to thank Sean, that's very helpful. Like Sean was saying, this was obviously this is a big topic when it comes to sonographers' injury and the related time that is sort of lost in terms of sonographers either recovering from these injuries or just as a result of them having to change their profession, the amount of years they've spent in training kind of gets it's a very big loss to the sort of medical hospitals and the medical setting at large. But that was kind of the background that sort of prompted us to do some of this work. And a lot of this work is in collaboration with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where Dr. Brian Anthony and his group work on a lot of ultrasound related technology as well. So when we looked at this and we kind of took a background of it, like Sean was mentioning, there's a lot of survey data, but there was very limited sort of objective or quantitative measurements of exposures. And if in this one of these slides here, I just want to point this out, that which Sean was talking about, that applying transducer pressure was one of the biggest job demands among sonographers. And that was pretty much the feedback that we had received as well. So we designed the study just to see if a novel high resolution force measuring probe that can precisely measure and compare sonographer scan forces can be developed and used to measure what these forces are that the sonographers are applying while scanning. That would be sort of a first step towards at least objectively measuring these forces that they need to apply. So the MIT group and the Mass General group, as a team, we developed this high resolution force measuring device. And the first version of it was developed on a GE C15D abdominal transducer, but since we've also been using it on several different transducers made by different manufacturers. And as I go through it, it's essentially made up of very simple components. There's like a clamp that goes onto the transducer, and within the transducer is the force measuring 6-axis load cell that can measure the forces without getting into too much technical details. But as you will see in this over here, that this clamp with the device within it can be designed for any probe. And towards the end, I can speak a little more about why I mentioned that particularly. It's a quick attachment and removal device. Here's a quick video just to show that it doesn't sort of hamper with the workflow, so to speak. So if you have a transducer that can just quickly be placed within this device and you're all set to scan, it does sort of distort the normal shape of the transducer itself, but we did pay attention to sort of give it the same shape without adding too much width to the transducer itself. And the device, what it does is it measures not only the transducer forces, but also the torques and angles in real time. And here's a quick video of us testing the device over a phantom. And on the screen, you will see that as you apply force, you can see the direct contact force being measured. And this works pretty well. There is sort of very little associate software around it. The software can be applied to any, can be installed on any of the laptops or desktops, be it a Mac or be it Windows. And again, just to sort of quickly go over the parts that are involved, this is sort of the USB board that connects to the transducer clamp and the monitor itself. That can be any monitor essentially. And at the time of the study, that is what we were using. So we had to go through IRB approval, as we have to for any study that involves scanning patients. And participation was entirely voluntary. So I said patients, but essentially subjects who volunteered to participate in this were eligible to take part. Informed consent was obtained, and in all 47 studies were performed, and sonographers performed a routine abdominal sonogram on healthy volunteers with a range of BMIs. So essentially the entire abdominal scan, as they would do on any normal patient coming into the hospital. And the volunteers had a range of BMIs that I will talk about. But for purposes of analysis, we split the sonographers into two groups, more experienced and less experienced. This is an arbitrary number, greater than 5 years and less than 5 years. What we essentially wanted to see is would some of the more experienced sonographers who have been scanning for a while have lesser use of force as compared to the less experienced sonographers who might be using more force so as to generate better images. And similarly, the volunteers were classified into two groups: a normal BMI group and a high BMI group. Patients with subjects with greater than 25 BMI. So there were 4 in that category and 6 in the normal BMI category. So in all, 12 sonographers, mean experience 10.3 years. It ranged from 1 year experience to 33 years. So I think there were a couple who had more than 20 years of scanning experience, and one of them was had been scanning for 33 years. And an average of 4 scans ranging from 2 to 6, and the 10 volunteers with a mean BMI of 26.9, range being 20.8, which would be a very thin patient, and a BMI of 36. So here's just a quick picture just to show the setup at the time of the study. And as you will see, the transducer has been covered with a probe just so that the gel doesn't get in. But there have been iterations to this method as well in the new versions of the device. And the other thing is you see the monitor setup here, which is sort of away from the sonographer who's scanning. And this was largely because so that the sonographer is not sort of does not change the force that they would normally apply based on what they see on the monitor. And 47 scans, approximately 9 minutes each. And again, these are healthy subjects, so much quicker scans as opposed to a patient who would have some pathology, and then you would spend longer amount of time labeling the studies and taking pictures of the related pathology. So all images were of diagnostic quality, and an abdominal radiologist with more than 15 years of experience looked at all the images just to make sure that all the images were of adequate quality that would be used in a normal day-to-day abdominal scan as well. And in all, around 7.5 hours of total scan time was done for the purposes of this study, and the probe contact force throughout those 7.5 hours was recorded. And then the results were compared, and if you see between the BMI groups, the normal BMI group and the high BMI group, the contact force, the mean force for the normal BMI group was 7.5 newtons. And intuitively, as you would expect, at the high BMI group, a higher force was needed, and that the mean was 9.8 newtons. We did record also the maximum force that was used for these exams, and in the normal BMI group, the maximum force at any given point, it was 17.3 Newton. In the high BMI group, this was again higher. It was 22.4 Newton. And both the results for mean and max were statistically significant between the normal BMI and high BMI group, as you would expect. When you see this data in terms of a histogram, the force as opposed to the amount of times the sonographer was at that particular force. So for example, if for a particular patient, the force that they were using over the period of that 9 minutes of scanning, which was the average time, you will see this sort of equal distribution, and left of the red line is essentially forces that are 0 because at that given point the transducer was off the patient's skin. And you will see that the mean force was 8.3 newtons and the maximum was 36.5 newtons. So when you compare sonographers, the less versus more experienced, there was not actually a statistically significant difference there. The less experienced sonographers used a mean force of 8 newtons, whereas the more experienced, that's more than 5 years of experience, used 8.3 newtons. So not something that we wanted to sort of that we had expected, because intuitively you would think someone who's the more experienced sonographers sort of are used to using a lower force, but that didn't seem to be the case in the study, and that could largely be because of what is essentially known as the different styles of imaging from one sonographer to another, and that, I guess, does not really depend on experience based on these early results. So in conclusion, the sonographer exertion can be accurately measured with a high resolution force measurement system. There is a large intersonographer force variability. It sort of doesn't depend on the experience per se, but there is variability among sonographers, like we saw, especially when it comes to scanning high BMI subjects. And significantly more force, as expected, is applied when scanning higher BMI subjects. That result was statistically significant, and contact force does not vary with years of experience, like I mentioned. So these, of course, just to stay on the slide for a quick second, these are early results from a relatively very small study, but essentially the goal, and as the article's title, is sort of a step towards quantifying those sonographer forces that they apply. And I think larger studies, and we'll talk about this in the discussion as well, and Sean can fill us in a little more as to what he thinks are the real impacts of this study. But just to very quickly go over some of the other applications that this device has been used for now, not only for assessing the sonographer forces, but for those familiar with the medical field, different disease processes can depend upon, the diagnosis can depend upon how a sonographer measures it. And one of them is a thyroid nodule. So for those familiar with thyroid elastography, a benign thyroid nodule, when measured on elastography, and here's an image of a benign thyroid nodule, and you measure it, it is 8.88 kilopascals, which is sort of very similar to normal thyroid here, which is 8.84, and you're sort of very confident that this nodule is benign. But a malignant thyroid nodule on elastography measures 49.65 kilopascals, and the normal thyroid is 12.94. And as you will see in these images, you can very clearly, as compared to the previous, see that this is a malignant nodule because of these very high values. But what you will also see, and I'm sorry, I apologize, it's again crashing on me. So as I pull this up, what you will also see on this is that these forces can also vary depending upon the force that is applied at the time of measurement. And I will show you a quick example. Here's a thyroid nodule that's been measured at a normal B mode and different levels of forces. So 1 Newton all the way up to 9 Newton on the right image. And this is the same thyroid nodule. But if you press hard enough, you can look at the value go up from 10.9 kilopascals to 21.8 kilopascals on the right corner image. And what that means is essentially that a benign nodule, which has roughly 9 kilopascals value, can be pushed up to a significantly higher value if you applied too much force over the nodule. And here's a quick image of a muscle, again, from 1 Newton all the way up to 18 Newton. And you see the values on the images going up from 21 kilopascals all the way up to 64.1 kilopascals. So just another quick example to show you that how sonographer forces, when trying to sort of diagnose a disease process, can impact results as well. So this was one application. Then the other application that in the medical field that this is more research than regular clinical is if you could potentially measure the force against your carotid artery pulsations and use algorithms to calculate blood pressure, that has significant utility. And without getting into the details, the usual method of measuring blood pressure from a cuff tied around your arm is used extensively, but there are certain limitations to it. And using an imaging-based method has high utility, especially in an operating room scenario, or even in the intensive care unit. And here's just a quick video and an image from some of the data that we collected using this method and this device. Without going into the details, the accuracy was shown to be sort of within 2 millimeters of the systolic pressure, within -4, and the precision around 12, which is very well. I don't know why this keeps crashing on me. I apologize. Give me 1 second while I pull it up again. So that's another one application that we've been using this this device for. And the subsequent iteration of this device is is to see if, instead of measuring just the variability in the force being applied, if there was a way that you could standardize the force being applied amongst, I think I'm going to avoid making this a full screen just to see if that helps it not crashing. But if everybody can see it on this image here, that the new iteration that allows sort of no matter what force you applied on the transducer, the device would calibrate itself, and the transmitting force on this patient's skin would remain the same. So there's significant advantages of this, and we can talk about this more in the discussion. But at this point, I think I can pass it on to Sean just to continue a little bit of discussion around what he thinks are the utilities of this device, and again, just injury prevention in sonographers in general.
Yeah, so I think, kind of leading off from that there, there's opportunities, of course, here to improve, quality of diagnostics and those sorts of things. And so I know we've talked about potentially how this could be utilized to give feedback potentially to sonographers or to individuals who are using this to do imaging. So not only can they help to learn what type of pressure and what type of force needs to be applied in order to get appropriate diagnostics, but once we can kind of figure this out, then we might be able to actually provide some feedback of, you're pressing too hard and you don't need to press that hard. The transducer is already taking over for you, and kind of helping to reduce some of that force that's needed to be applied. So I think there's some interesting applications for this potentially. If we look at kind of where the current status is of the literature itself, I have this kind of table here that lists all of the kind of work-related sonography literature up until about a year or so ago. And you can see here, kind of as I mentioned at the beginning, really there's been a lot of survey studies. You can see them, all the way back to 1993, kind of one of the very first ones that was a large study, and pretty much consistently over time doing those studies. Fewer and fewer studies than when we get into the actual more intervention trials. You can see that there's only been, as of, again, I believe this is up through 2016 maybe, there's only 4 or 5 studies that actually have looked at direct interventions for kind of sonographers and injuries. The Boulder is the group that, the group that I've been working with, Dr. Kevin Evans at the Ohio State University, and myself. We've kind of been looking at this problem and trying to develop some ideas of how do we actually go forward with some different interventions. And, there's some articles that have talked about looking at ergonomics and training for sonographers. And when you go and look at the sonographers and talk to sonographers and look at the problems in the field, training only goes so far. really what we're finding and what we're seeing is that it's more about the environment that they're working in, and we need to be looking broader than just the ergonomics and how the individual sonographer kind of works. So I know that that's where a lot of the different interventions have been in the past, as well as looking at equipment itself and trying to modify the equipment. And of course, this transducer probe is a modification, but I think really what it needs to be is kind of a blend of all of those things together. There's a lot of, when we talk to sonographers that are in the field, it's a lot of issues around the workplace environment itself, and how much rest time they get. And what's happened is the technology continues to advance, and the sonography machines are getting better. So the imaging is getting better and faster. There's a lot of automation in the machines that you can run through, and it will automatically take the images for you as you work through a protocol. And so exams are getting quicker, which just from an administrative standpoint is great, because they say, oh, wonderful, now your productivity, we can expect more from you. So sonographers are now running from one exam to the next exam to the next exam to the next exam, or they're getting patients scheduled in shorter windows because the technology is better, and that's all administration sees, and sonographers are not getting the adequate break time they need. So this, the kind of moving forward as far as, what some of the newer surveys are showing, are going beyond just the fact that there's the injuries, and really looking into, some of the more environmental components of this, and some of the factors that we may need to look at as more administrative controls to kind of partner with the individual controls and engineering controls that we've already looked at and don't seem to really be making too much of a dent in the actual prevalence here. So on the next slide here, you'll see the Society of Diagnostic Medical Sonography. In the past, I believe it was about almost 10 years ago now, they released some industry standards for prevention of injuries in sonographers and ergonomics. They redid this conference in 2016, and what they had, and this is available if you just do a quick Google search for SDMS, again, the Society for Diagnostic Medical Sonography, SDMS and ergonomics, it pops pretty much right up, this PDF. It's publicly available as the industry standards. They did a consensus conference that reviewed the previous standards and kind of did an update for where things are. And this was basically bringing together representatives from all of the professional societies related to ultrasound and sonography. So that included the American College of Radiology, phlebotomy, American Institute of Ultrasound and Medicine, and then the Society for Radiologists and Vascular Ultrasound, and kind of all the different imaging groups, as well as a lot of different equipment manufacturers and some ergonomists that are, work out in the field. So at this conference, they kind of went through the previous standards, talked about, what the evidence, has shown and where things are, and what kind of priorities need to be laid out to help the field understand where they can intervene and where they can kind of address some of these issues. And so the standards actually go through all of these different regions, first of all with the equipment itself, and talking about the different systems. And so one of the main things that we're seeing now in the field is that, again, things are getting more automated, and things are getting smaller. So this is also creating some new problems with what's referred to as point of care ultrasound. And a lot of the point of care devices are meant to be carried around and moved around. And so those devices are things that we're still trying to understand the implications per se of kind of what the ergonomic challenges might be for those, but we're finding that the ergonomic challenges to those may be similar to what you would see with iPads and smartphones and those sorts of things. And looking now at the sonographer, instead of pushing a machine around, they're now carrying a machine and doing things like that. So we're getting into some different things there. What that leads into then is, how does the sonographer set their workstation up with these point of care devices? Are they able to better understand their positioning and posturing, and can they fit into smaller spaces potentially, as as long as they have the ability to set it up. So there's some new challenges that keep coming up as things kind of advance with the technology. And then also just thinking about the beds and the chair and kind of the other equipment that's in the room. There are standards that are, or there's information then that follows about the employer responsibility. And again, I think this is where what we're hearing from the sonographers in the field, this is where they feel like really is where we need to target some of the interventions and some of the exploration is around what's happening administratively. Not purely from a risk management standpoint, because I think all employers really kind of understand the risk management, but really getting into the scheduling. And again, how many patients are scheduled, what is the time that's allowed for recovery, and those sorts of things. And then also, you know, kind of more of a broader perspective of what is the workstation and what does the room look like. And I know the group at Ohio State has completed recently a very extensive, I believe funded by the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, a process where they did some different focus groups and prototyped some new equipment and devices, and also a second grant where they were looking at the medical hospital room itself. So I know that group has a couple of things that are starting to come out in publication related to imaging and radiologic professionals in general, but specific to sonography as far as different devices that may help in equipment. And then secondly, thinking about the organization of the hospital room and the design of the room itself. And that takes into account not just sonographers, but the nurses, the doctors, you know, all the other folks that need to come in and out of the room. You know, typically those rooms have been designed more from a medical perspective. And now, you know, there's really hopefully some more focus on thinking about all of the allied health professionals that come in and the needs of those individuals and how they need to move about the room. I think a little better is when you're working with a facility that is doing imaging itself. Those rooms tend to be a little better designed, but still there needs to be some focus on ensuring that that the imaging professionals are involved in helping to design those rooms to ensure that they have the space they need to move around and get the equipment in the appropriate places. In addition to the machine, you know, we also have to realize that sonographers, radiologists all are using computer workstations. They're all using PACS systems or archival systems where they go in to look up the images or uploading images to those systems. So there are other things also that I think, as far as the workstation, that are able to be looked at and kind of look at overall kind of ergonomics for the individual to kind of make sure that the entire environment is safe. The other sections of these standards kind of go into thinking again about the sonographer themselves, and that really gets into the ergonomics, safe patient handling, proper positioning, and kind of just being aware of how you're using your body and those sorts of things. And then really the last part, it's not a lot in the industry standards, but I think that this is where potentially we also can make a pretty big impact, is in the academic preparation and then the clinical education. And you know, one of the things that we found early in our research was that sonographers were, when I would come in as, you know, kind of an injury prevention ergonomics professional in the workplace and say, oh, you know, you're in a really awkward position and you're applying force in a weird way and you've got your arm out to the side, and if you just move the machine here and you just put the transducer in this direction, you would actually be in a much better position and you would be saving your body because you're doing this over and over and over again. What I would hear from a lot of the more experienced sonographers was, well, I was trained to do it this way, and I'm afraid that if I move or I change my posture, my position, that I won't get the images that I need to get. I'm afraid that I won't get the images. I'm afraid I won't be able to apply the exact amount of force or the direct angle of the transducer I need, and therefore I'll get images that are not correct, and I may miss a diagnosis, and I don't want to do that to my patient. So I think there is some misconceptions or some things that we would need to help the professions get over, as far as, you know, it's okay, you can change your position and you still will get the appropriate images. And I think some of that could also just be kind of taken away if we're training the students to begin with in the direct way. So I think it's important to ensure that's happening, and I know that in the accreditation standards for programs, they're required to do some sort of ergonomics education, but there really is no standard or detailed kind of information out there. And so programs are kind of up to their own to decide what that means and how often they do that. So I think that there's opportunity to really look at how do we provide some more standardized training for our sonographers and those coming into the profession in the field. In addition to that, I think it's even more important because even though they're not using it consistently, ultrasound has now become, a tool that most physicians are using, and I believe that across the country, pretty much the vast majority of medical programs include ultrasound training as part of the preliminary training for all medical professionals, or sorry, I should say physicians. And we are getting some training in other fields as well. So I know physical therapists are starting to use this, midwives. There are a lot of other professionals because the technology is becoming much more user-friendly and less technical to actually use for quick screening and assessments. Of course, sonographers are still doing the detailed and radiologists are still doing the detailed scans, but for early screening as a first line of defense, a lot of other professionals are now using this. So I think that there's also some important opportunity here to make sure that we're thinking about how do we actually either change or improve the devices themselves or ensure that there is appropriate understanding of proper ergonomics and use. And for more novice users, what I've seen with training is how they hold the transducer and how they apply pressure is usually not so good. And so I think that could be even more of an issue, kind of relating back to this pressure and thinking not just about the force, the surface force that's being applied, but how much are they gripping on the transducer, squeezing the transducer, and how hard are they actually pushing on the transducer when they may not need to do that. So I think there's some opportunity to think about some biofeedback type mechanisms, some additional training, both in the academic setting and of course for current clinicians and practitioners. So that's kind of where things are. The Journal of Diagnostic Medical Sonography, along with these standards, just to let everybody know who might be interested in this, if you look up the journal, it was last fall, I believe the September-October issue was a dedicated issue toward ergonomics and injuries in sonographers. So there were 5 or 6 additional articles that talk about this. And a guest editorial that kind of talks about the kind of status of where things are that I would refer you to look. And then I also know that there's quite a few other articles in the work journal as well over the past that have talked about this and looked at kind of injuries and injury prevention. So I think there's a lot of resources out there and kind of places that we can move forward. And certainly, we're moving forward from the perspective of kind of our work and looking at how can we maybe build in some of these training pieces and some of the biofeedback. And I think it speaks to maybe even a broader concern of ergonomics from my perspective in general of we can train people to death of what proper position and posture is and how to do things, and we all slide into our behaviors and what we find to be comfortable. So I think there's a bigger issue here of how do we actually do things that training and provide ergonomics training and provide enough information to the person that they're willing to change their behavior and before they're having pain and problems to do so. And so I think there's opportunities to look at biofeedback. We're also potentially exploring uses of things like mindfulness and some other intervention techniques that can help people become more conscientious, alert, aware, taking the time to think about where they are, think about their situation before they actually just jump in and get so involved in doing their patient care that they're putting themselves in awkward positions and things of that sort. So that's kind of where we're looking, and we're also exploring this organizational administrative kind of angle as well to see, is there a way that we can figure out how to better improve the workflow and the work processes to help with some of these problems that are going on. So I think there's a lot happening. There's a lot of opportunity here, and we're certainly very excited about kind of continuing our research as we move forward. So I think that's kind of what I have to share about where the current status is. I don't know if there's anything else, Manish, that you want to finish up with and kind of share before we kind of invite Karen to join us again.
That's a very comprehensive discussion around that, Sean. Thank you. I think that covers most aspects, and obviously your group has been involved in this field for a very long time, and I think this is a great summary. Just looking at, just to quickly add, I think like you were mentioning, that the use of ultrasound is going up significantly, and I second that. That now most medical programs across the country, I believe a couple, in fact, provide handheld ultrasound devices to the medical students. So going forward, it's very important, like you said, correct postures and the amount of time that it's being used, keeping those in mind is going to be very important going forward.
Thank you both for such an interesting presentation and the work that you're doing. I thought the overview at the end of what could happen in the future is pretty profound in what we might be able to do as clinicians and educators. You know, if you were to have major funding, both of you, what kind of research project might you put together that really addresses some of the issues you talked about, behavior change being one of them? So unlimited money, let's make this kind of magical. What kind of project would you put together next to investigate? And maybe it's an intervention.
So I can speak up here. If I had unlimited money, I think I would love to change the world of the way we actually use sonography in the clinic. And I think, again, back to this aspect of productivity and time and making sure that we're giving the sonographers kind of the amount of recovery time that they need, and then developing the equipment to kind of help them support that. So for me, it would be somehow developing, this approach to look at how can we both modify the workplace and then at the same time develop a smart device, or maybe even, using artificial intelligence built into the device and the machine that will interact with the user, so that the user can see, oh, I'm working in, maybe they can see an image of themselves or a reflection of themselves, as well as be getting some sort of sensory feedback or visual feedback about their posture positioning, and at the same time the amount of force that they're applying, that kind of covers all of these things to help support the user and say, yes, I'm doing something inappropriate, and work on, you can't ignore it. You see the biofeedback, you see it there, you see that you're doing something inappropriate, and it automatically causes you to fix the problem. I think that it would take a lot of money to, one, just develop and build that device and test all of that out and figure out how to integrate it. And then secondly, working with the organization itself to integrate that into their workflow. And I think that's the second big issue of how do we actually change practice? How do we change administration and get them to understand, yes, this is maybe hiring an additional sonographer to fill the workload, but at the same time, we're saving on our costs for injuries in the profession or for overworking our professionals such that they leave after 5 years or leave after 10 years and we have to replace them again. So I think that those are kind of my big ones and things that I would be interested in. And so I don't know, Manish, if there's other things that you would see if you had unlimited money of what you would want to do.
Yeah, boy, unlimited money. That's interesting. But I think I just want to very quickly, I'm trying to pick up the slide here. Yeah. I think, Sean, you spoke about this, that when you spoke to a lot of the sonographers about, their behavioral change, and you mentioned that one of them, in fact, a few of them told you that, that's how they were trained. And the key answer, I think, was, I don't want to miss getting an image for my patient by changing the way I scan. And just to highlight that, I think it speaks volumes about this occupation. You have people who are scanning in pain, who are scanning a lot of times knowing that they will have a career-ending injury at time, but they don't stop at at anything. They overcome that pain at times to get the relevant images so that a patient doesn't have to come back, or that the radiologist can see images and make a diagnosis for the patient who may be in pain or who is just suffering in general, saving them another trip to the hospital. So kind of highlighting on that, I think exactly to what Sean said, it's, if you look at these numbers, and I pulled up this slide just to highlight it again, 80% of physician sonographers in Australia and United Kingdom. So it's not just sonographers here in North America, it's even the physician sonographers. So it's essentially, if you think of it, it's clearly much more than a behavioral problem. It's more of just the act of scanning and getting images on patients almost causing these injuries. So I think if you see 90% of sonographers scanning in pain, 20% with a career-ending injury, and these numbers are just astounding, I think using that money to build real-time feedback, where you're almost diagnosing the sonographers themselves while they scan, I think is a key. You, in an ideal world where you, like Karen said, you have unlimited money, you don't want somebody to be scanning in pain, trying to diagnose why the patient is in pain. So I think in that effect, that real-time biofeedback as to what's going on is important. Can we diagnose this early? Can there be a point where the department realizes that if that biofeedback is at a certain level where you can diagnose that via electromyography or some sort of biofeedback, that the patient scanning, the sonographer or physician is scanning in pain, and they are maybe just not scan for a day, alternatively, or prevent these injuries in the long run. Definitely those 20% of career-ending injuries are a lot. 1 in 5 sonographers having to end a career after having trained for so long. I think just not for the sonographer itself, it's a big loss for the community to having spent the resources and the time to train somebody to get these to deliver patient care, and then losing them over time is a big loss. So definitely the biofeedback in real time is where I would put that unlimited money in. What are the specifics to that? I think that, like we spoke about earlier in the presentation, I think that is going to need a collaboration of people coming up with all the potential ways we can do it, and investing that money in that. And there are more ways than one of doing this, like we discussed during the presentation. I don't know. Sorry about that, Karen. Oh, very long-winded, but you gave me a dream. You gave me a dream, and I was stretching.
I loved it because I can see bringing in so many other professions to do this, and I wish that you could apply for some funding that could support what both of you described. They were really this similar, same thing, because as you said, that this is not just a North American issue, but it's an issue probably globally that needs to be addressed. And so I wish you that unlimited money in a grant or a foundation that wants to really address this. We're going to conclude our Learn at Work webinar now, and I want to thank both of you, first of all, for publishing your study in our journal, Work, and for taking the time to be here today. For those of you who are listening to this webinar, we hope you'll subscribe to the Learn at Work YouTube channel so that you'll be notified when new webinars are available. So thank you again, and thank you for being with us. And what a fascinating study, and such an important population of workers to work with. Thanks again, everyone.
Karen, thank you so much. I just quickly, before we end, I wanted to quickly add that our collaborators over at MIT, essentially Brian Anthony, who led this project from MIT, is happy to make work with people who want to use this device. And if that is something that they're interested in, they can reach out to Dr. Brian Anthony at MIT.
Thank you so much. That's great. That's a great way to conclude, because we want collaboration like that. And I'm hoping that people will listen and will reach out. Thank you both again, and I wish everyone a meaningful day.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Karen. Thanks, Sean. Have a good day, everybody. Bye.